Good morning and good to see everyone today. Very excited. We're going to start talking about alternatives to classical liberalism. We talked about social contract theory and the development of social contract theory and classical liberalism and political liberalism, which really are uh, the political theories that evolve out of social contract theory. We're going to look at two major challenges to classical liberalism or liberalism in general, and that is Marxism on the left and fascism on the right. But today we're going to focus on Marxism. And again, classical liberalism, the system that we live in, the system that we take for granted as simply being the default political system, within liberalism, the central problem of politics is and has always been the protection of individual freedom and liberty. And so the idea is that we create structures and institutions from within which individuals can pursue their vision of the good. And so when we think about classical liberalism, classical liberalism is, of course, characterized by representative democracy. Now, our form of government is a republic, but make no mistake, these are just variations on democratic themes. Ultimately, the people have sovereignty. And even within our system, which is a constitutional republic, the people have ultimate power over the structure of the government, and the Constitution itself can be amended by the people. And so make no mistake, that is democracy. Constitutionalism, and again, there is always tension, and Rawls talks about this, and I don't think we pay enough attention to this within classical liberalism. There is always tension between the good of the individual and the needs of the majority. So there's always tension between democracy, which is based on rule of the majority, and the desires of the individual to kind of live their own life. And so we figured out a variety of ways to deal with that or ameliorate that problem. And usually that's some form of constitutionalism. That's a constitution is a document that protects individuals from abuses by the government, really. So another way to think of this is that it puts restraints on what the majority can do. And as de Tocqueville pointed out, the tyranny of the majority is a real problem because it can lead to political minorities being oppressed. Protection of civil liberties under the rule of law. This is something that we take for granted, going all the way back to the Magna Carta, and we talked about the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights of 1689, and due process, fairness in the political system, and that's fairness in how the law is applied and fairness in the law itself. Political freedom, freedom of speech, all these things we take for granted. These are cornerstones of classical liberalism. Emphasis on individual autonomy, limited government, and almost always a high degree of economic freedom, market-based economic system, usually, limited state control. Generally, we refer to this some type of capitalism, although capitalism itself is a kind of umbrella term. And as we are going to talk about, there are no pure economic systems. All economic systems are really mixed systems. And so if we think about modernity and the progeny of classical liberalism, and we can think about American political culture, well, you have the right and left in the United States, again, both fall under the umbrella of classical liberalism. Conservatism, the right in the United States, they're right in line with the focus on protecting the individual and autonomy and preserving economic liberties. And libertarians take this to an extreme that the only legitimate state is remember going back to Nozick is a kind of protective organization that ensures that our rights are not violated, and that's it. Now, on the left in the United States, you have social liberals. The focus is still on preserving individual autonomy, but the focus is on social liberties. And then progressivism, and this simply takes classical liberalism and merges it with a welfare state. All of these fit very neatly under the umbrella of classical liberalism. And we take all of this for granted. As we do the economic system, now we can evaluate economic systems and political systems differently. Now, Marx will not, and I think, for interesting reasons. But we can talk about, under classical liberalism, we can talk about the political system and the economic system in different terms. However, it is generally true that we're usually dealing with some form of capitalism. And capitalism is an umbrella term for a variety of economic systems based on some kind of market price mechanism, the private ownership of the means of production, and their operation for a profit. And so those are the kind of defining characteristics of capitalism. And there are a variety of different types of capitalism. And again, there are no pure economic systems. This is something that we talk about in textbooks and classrooms and economic seminars. But when it comes down to it, all economies are different and mixed, and there are a variety of different elements depending on what the society is willing to tolerate. And the best way to think about any economic system is as a system of incentives. What do we want people to do, and how do we get people to do that? Right? Now, Marx focuses exclusively on economics. From the Marxist perspective, economic conditions shape politics. You can't talk about politics without talking about economics. Why does Marx focus on economics? He believes that the political system is shaped by the underlying economic structure of society. That kind of makes sense if you think about it, because human beings must first secure food, shelter, and the means of survival before they can develop politics or culture. And this goes to the heart of what Marxism is really about, and what Marx believes is human nature. Remember, Aristotle defined human beings as political animals. I think Marx would define humans as economic animals. We are primarily concerned with using our labor to support our own survival. And that's primary. And so that's a big part of what it means to be human. A consequence of this is that legal and political institutions are secondary to the economic system. And again, as a consequence of this, the legal and political institutions generally function to protect the interest of the dominant economic class. And that is a big insight for Marx, because when we're talking about politics, we can get caught up in talking about politics and rights and institutions, but all of that stuff is secondary for Marx, because our primary nature is economic. What's the big deal with capitalism? Okay. And Marx will spend a lot of time talking about capitalism. So what's the problem here with capitalism, the economic system that is attended to classical liberalism? Now, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, we can't forget about Engels. And folks, I'm just going to bring this up. And I love reading Marx and Engels. I mean, Marx is an incredible mind. But a lot of what we take to be Marx is a collaborative work between he and Engels, and we don't want to overlook the contribution of Engels. We don't. And again, I love reading Marx, and Marx is brilliant. Clearly, you begin his works, and now I disagree with a great deal of what Marx wrote. But again, it's almost impossible not to be impressed by the scope of his knowledge and understanding. So it's exciting to read Marx for sure. Now, Marx and Engels argued that capitalist society, and here's an overview of Marxism. If you want to know what Marxism is, here it is on a bumper sticker or a nutshell, right? Capitalist society causes an economic minority. Marx refers to this economic minority as the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, to dominate and exploit the economic majority, the workers, the proletariat, by the way in which unpaid labor is extracted from the working class. So Marx is not only going to focus on economics, he's going to focus on the means of production. And that's going to kind of change the perspective that we have on capitalism, because when people normally talk about capitalism, we talk about the inevitability of the market. Even when we talked about Nozick, remember, and the Wilt Chamberlain example. Nozick was talking about how markets originate and how markets evolve and how markets are inevitable, which may all be true. But here, Marx is focusing on how things actually get produced. And that's going to change the analysis a little bit. Now, the tension between the owners of capital, the bourgeoisie, and the workers, proletariat, will inevitably produce a worldwide revolution in which communism will prevail. Now, this is not an aspirational goal for Marx. Marx considers himself to be a kind of social scientist. And on the basis of his observations, he's saying that it is this tension will inevitably bring forth a revolution. And that's a bold prediction, my friend. But you got to give it to Marx. He's not waffling here. Communism will prevail in some form. Inevitably, history is moving towards that goal. Now for some good news, bad news, I don't know. But I'm going to complicate things here because Marx complicated enough, but it's really difficult to understand Marx unless you understand this guy here. And this guy, notoriously difficult to understand, Hegel. These German philosophers, what Kant, Marx, Hegel, wow, they're all very challenging. They are. But in order to understand Marx, we have to go over Hegel, because Marx, to a certain extent, is a kind of Hegelian. Now, he's going to really radically transform Hegelianism, but at the heart of his system, you can see Hegel very clearly, okay? So I hope you guys are ready for this. Now, the good news is that you guys are going to understand this because you all have been exposed to Hegel's idea of the dialectic. You all have, in some form, somewhere, you've been exposed to this. So this is not going to be out of the blue. Hegel was fascinated by history, loved history, and he believed that history was guided by a rational process directed, okay, wait for it, directed by an absolute spirit. He referred to this absolute spirit as the Geist. Could you call this God? Sure. Many people do. But it's not a personal God. This Geist is becoming fully self-conscious through creation of the world. This is an interesting idea. The idea that God is directing history, but God is becoming as the world is becoming. God is evolving as the world is evolving. The spirit is evolving as the world is becoming more complex and interesting. So is the spirit. The Geist is becoming fully self-conscious through creation of the world. Now, Hegel believes that as history and consciousness evolve, and they are evolving, so does God, so does the spirit, so does the Geist. Ultimately, the Geist is leading humanity to absolute freedom. So history, there's a roadmap to history. There's a process. There's an end. We're on a journey. We are on a journey, and we're leading to absolute freedom. Now, what is the mechanism by which history unfolds? I'm glad you asked. It's called the dialectic. And all of you have heard about the dialectic. What is it? According to Hegel, the Geist is constantly evolving through a process where contradictory ideas, okay, folks, for Hegel, this is all about ideas, very abstract, contradictory ideas are reconciled and merged together. This is how history moves forward. And this is really fascinating. And you can see how so many philosophers have picked up on this idea. There's dialectic everywhere. And, many people in popular culture have done this. This idea of the dialectic is a very powerful idea. Contradictory ideas clash, but through this conflict, the ideas become reconciled. Nothing in the universe is static. Nothing stands still. Every idea or form of life contains internal tensions. There's no perfection on this world, right? Everything contains this tension, this internal tension. But these contradictions push the idea beyond itself. Now, the movement of the conflict between these ideas actually has a recognizable pattern. And this process is called the dialectic. We begin with an idea about the world. That's our thesis. We begin with an idea about the world. Now, Hegel doesn't use this simplistic language but this is perfectly, for our purposes, this is perfectly fine. But we begin with an idea about the world. That's our thesis. But the idea that we have about the world is incomplete in some way. It contains a flaw. It contains a contradiction. The flaw in the idea creates a conflict that gives rise to a counter idea. And that counter idea is called the antithesis. So we start with an idea, but that idea has some kind of internal tension, some kind of internal contradiction. It doesn't quite work to explain what we want to explain. And so that tension gives rise to a counter idea, the antithesis. These two ideas will eventually reconcile into a third unifying idea, the synthesis. And this is how we move forward. The synthesis contains the best parts of both ideas, leading to a higher level of understanding. So when one idea is overcome, it isn't simply destroyed, rather, it is absorbed into a richer, more developed whole. This is how history moves forward through the dialectical process. And so history is evolving, right? And humanity is evolving along with it. And the spirit is evolving along with it. And God is evolving along with it. But this process leads to, unlike evolution, this process leads somewhere. Where is it leading to? Absolute freedom. So let's think of the idea of human freedom. Now, the ancient Greeks, what did they think about freedom? Well, the ancient Greeks defined freedom in purely negative terms. To be free was not to be a slave. Remember, ancient Greece was a slave-based economy, right? Everybody knows that, right? And so if you were a Greek, if you were an Athenian, or you were a Theban, or you were a Spartan, you defined freedom as not being a slave. That's a pretty limited definition of freedom, isn't it? That definition of freedom has problems. What's the problem? Well, one can only be free if others are enslaved. That's a problem. This creates conflict. The master's freedom is illusory because it depends on the labor of the slave. Look, if I depend on the slave for my existence, how can I say that I'm free? I'm not really free because I'm completely dependent on somebody else's labor. Now, from the slave's perspective, they see their own agency in their work and they begin to desire liberation. So we have a conflict, right? A real conflict. A conflict between the slaves who desire liberation and the masters who want to keep everything as it is. But they can't keep everything as it is because their understanding of freedom is filled with tension. And so that tension has to be resolved. And so the slaves begin to resist their oppression. They begin to say things like, everybody should be free. What is this? This is the antithesis. And through this conflict, what happens? We get a synthesis. And for Hegel, the synthesis is the post-Enlightenment revolutions, like the French Revolution. How does this solve the problem? Well, the tension is solved because these Enlightenment revolutions liberate everybody from servitude and oppression, right? That's the synthesis. Everybody enjoys freedom equally as individuals. Problem solved. But not really. Why not? Hegel argues that these revolutions did not go far enough. They conceived of freedom abstractly without rational institutions. They also defined freedom in a purely negative way. Like my freedom is just the absence of constraint. The liberated individual now rebels against the limits imposed by the community and by nature. To be free in this age, one had to assert one's individuality against the restrictions of society. And this led to despotism. So the French Revolution, what eventually happened? There was a tyranny, there was a despotism that ultimately culminated in Napoleon. I mean, there was the terror led by Robespierre and Marat and Danton and all of the Committee of Public Safety. There were massacres, and ultimately there was despotism. So that, wow, okay, problem. So Hegel insists that freedom must evolve to a point where there is perfect integration between the individual self-determination, and the rest of society. So the private pursuit of individuals must be integrated into the larger community to create an interconnected whole, and this would be true freedom. And so this is where history is leading. What does Marx do? Marx really likes this concept of the dialectic. He does. You know what he doesn't like? He doesn't like all of the abstraction. Marx is a materialist. He did not believe that the forces that drove history were abstract. He believes that history is driving forward, but not because of some abstract conflict between ideas. Ideas are secondary. You know what's primary for Marx? Material conditions. The way we live, the way that we experience life, that's what's primary. Ideas follow. So yeah, there's a dialectic at work. So Hegel was right about that. But the dialectic works not in the abstract realm of ideas. The dialectic works in the real material conditions of the working class. Marx argued that poverty and oppression, that's what drives workers to seek change. The way that they experience hunger and pain and deprivation and suffering, when they're out there working in the actual material world, it's the material conditions that will bring about revolution, not some abstracted, reified, conflict between the idea. No, none of that. Poverty and oppression that workers experience every day, that's what drives them to make changes. And this change is inevitable. It's often said that Marx turns Hegel on his head. What does that mean? It means it's not ideas that drive history forward, it's material conditions. And it's the material conditions that create ideas. So for Marx, ideas are shaped by economic conditions. Labor is at the core of the human condition. Like what's the definitive characteristic of human beings? We have to get our hands dirty. We have to get out there and make a living. We have to figure out a way to use the power of labor to shape our environment. Labor is the core of human existence. Our work grounds our identity, our freedom, our creativity. It shapes our relations with other people. So labor is primary. Under capitalism, however, the harsh material conditions imposed on workers generate contradictions in their relationship to their own labor. I become estranged from my own labor, and my labor is the thing that makes me human. So this creates a tension, and this tension drives social and political transformation, not the other way around. Politics doesn't change anything, right? Ideology doesn't change anything. It's the material conditions I am forced to work in every day. That's what drives history forward. Okay, but what is it exactly about capitalism that will inevitably cause a communist revolution? Because again, this is where Marx is going. This is what he says, that these material conditions will inevitably cause a communist revolution. Now, I'm going to start with something that most kind of armchair Marxists miss. This is a very important observation, okay? And we don't want to just overlook it because it's inconvenient. Capitalism is necessary, absolutely necessary. It's a necessary economic stage of development. Because if we're going to redistribute goods, those goods have to be produced. And in order to produce those goods, we're going to have to build factories. And the only way that you build those factories is through capitalism. You got to build those factories, folks. So you don't get to socialism unless you expand it's the only way. You have to have markets, you have to have trade, you have to have concentration of capital to build the world in which socialism can flourish. So capitalism dramatically expands productive capacity, trade and technology, creating material abundance. If you can't create material abundance, there's nothing to distribute to anyone. There's no factories for the workers to take over. Now, but Marx claims that capitalism is ultimately destructive because, and here's the main problem with capitalism, it substitutes exchange value for use value. Okay, what does this mean? Now think about why people work and go back to this idea of labor being the definitive characteristic of my humanity. Like, I'm thrown into the world and my labor is a way for me to survive and thrive. Through my labor, I can produce things that are of use to me in overcoming the challenges of survival. But capitalism isn't concerned with that. Capitalism isn't concerned with satisfying human needs. Capitalism is only concerned with what price a good can capture in a market exchange, not if that good is actually contributing to the survival of someone, or it can be used, or it's useful. That's not what makes something valuable. In a capitalist system, something is valuable only if it captures a certain price of exchange in a market. Eventually, capitalism even leads us to treat other people as exchangeable goods. Think about how perverse that is. In capitalism, everything has a price because everything can be exchanged for money. And that's really at the core of what Marx is talking about. Goods aren't about what they can be used for. What I produce is valuable because it can be exchanged for money. And that's a kind of perversion for Marx, really is. Labor is supposed to be the expression of our creativity and humanity. But in capitalism, all human relationships are determined by money, so the value system is distorted. My labor is supposed to be used to make my life better. I make things, and those things directly contribute to my flourishing. But in capitalism, that's not the way it works at all. The value system is distorted. People become less important than things. This is fundamentally inhumane. Everything is for sale, right? I mean, think about that. In a capitalist system, everything is for sale. And that's how we value things. Not will these things improve our lives? What price will that capture in a market? That's all we're concerned with. You guys have probably heard about Marx's concept of alienation, and it is a powerful, powerful concept. Capitalism makes workers alienated from their labor. alienated from the things they make, alienated from each other, and even alienated from themselves. So Marx says the alienation of man thus appears as the fundamental evil of capitalist society. I no longer recognize myself. I no longer recognize what I produce. I no longer am connected to the things that I produce, my own labor, the people that I work with. We're all just cogs in a machine now. That's all we are. Capitalism even turns workers against each other as they compete for jobs and wages. I should have natural solidarity with the people that I work next to. But think about this. Now that worker is a threat to me. And we say, oh my God, immigrants are coming to take our jobs. We don't think about each other in terms of our natural humanity and our solidarity, that we're all in the same situation. No, capitalism turns us against each other as competitors for the same hours and the same jobs and the same wages. And this is dehumanizing, because productive work is the thing that makes us human. It's not just our means of survival. It's also how we find self-fulfillment. It's also our outlet for creativity and satisfaction with life. We transform the world we live in through our own labor. But when the worker sells their labor to the owner of a factory, that worker is giving up the essence of their own humanity. The more the worker produces, the less they actually possess. And that's sad. And that alienation from our own labor is really at the heart of the Marxist critique of capitalism. Because workers do not control or own the products that they create, their labor is transformed into something external and separate from them. They feel no sense of fulfillment or joy. There's no joy in going to work. And they lack solidarity with others. Think about that. Monday morning comes around and you dread going to the office because it's the same thing every day, just more drudgery, more monotony, more despair. You don't feel a connection with anything that you're doing because you don't see the fruits of your own labor. Capitalism turns workers into mindless, isolated cogs in a profit-making machine. That's all that you are. You're just a cog in their machine. This brings us to Marx's surplus value theory of labor, okay? Everything of value comes from human productivity, everything. As the worker transforms raw materials into something better, value is added, right? I add value to the product that I make. I contribute value to that. Now, Marx calls this surplus value. The capitalist, the owner of capital, steals this surplus value to make a profit. So the value that I add to whatever I'm producing, the owner of the factory takes that and then uses that profit to enslave and oppress more workers in an endless cycle of oppression. So you think about the owner of the factory, right? And they're buying a yacht. Well, where does that yacht come from? That yacht comes from the surplus value of labor that they're exploiting. Now, I mean, I don't want to get into criticisms here, but the surplus value theory is often criticized by economists. And those are interesting discussions to have. But you can see what Marx is talking about. clearly, right? Christina says we're all robots. I work in a warehouse. I know this too well. Yeah, I mean you are of no importance to the machine. You're just there. You show up. You're working for a paycheck, right? That paycheck does not account for the full value of your labor that you're contributing to whatever you're producing. Yeah, and you feel that. You feel that alienation. Like you have no connection to the work that you're doing, to the labor that you're doing. You're simply there to get your paycheck and move on. And that's a perversion of what really labor means. There's no creativity, there's no joy in this process, and this is wrong from a Marxist perspective. Now, Marx argues that in order to maximize profit, the owners will continuously lower wages until the workers are impoverished. And this is not something that the owners do even intentionally. This is just as capitalists compete against each other. This is just the mechanism of the market forces the owners of capital to pay lower and lower wages. And working conditions become more extreme. And it doesn't, the intentions of the owners are irrelevant here because it's in the rational interest of owners to degrade the workers and oppress the workers and exploit the workers in order to make a profit. And this is what Marx calls class-based struggle. There's just no way to reconcile in this system the interest of the owners and the interest of the workers. They're antithetical. And of course, we understand the dialectic. We can see exactly where this is going to go. So this oppression, this inevitable oppression that happens will spark a revolution as workers begin to question their situation. I mean, you're showing up at the warehouse and you go, this really sucks. There's just something wrong with this. It's the same drudgery every day. I show up. There's no fulfillment. All the workers are in the same boat with you. It's the same story for everyone. And so the workers begin to talk and they begin to examine their situation. And the realization will slowly dawn on the workers that, wait a minute, they're the ones who are making everything. We're the ones who are making everything. And we're getting poorer while the bosses get richer. Why do we even need a boss? Like, we're the ones who are doing everything. Why do we even need a boss? That's an interesting question, isn't it? And Marx calls this revolutionary consciousness. Once you realize that you don't need the bosses, that you are the ones who are doing all the work, this changes everything, doesn't it? This changes the calculation. And so this brings us the recipe for revolution that Marx talks about. As competition increases, wealth becomes concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Wages drop. The working class expands. The proletariat gets larger. And the concentration of capital makes economic crises more extreme because there's a natural cycle in economics, right? But as capital becomes more and more concentrated, these economic crises get more extreme. During a crisis, laid off workers will refuse to leave the factories. They just won't leave. They'll say, no, we're not going. Violence begins to spread from industry to industry. Leaders will arrive and direct the violence. The military will be called in against the workers. But here's the thing. The military are just members of the proletariat too. And when the soldiers see that their interests don't align with the owners, the military will defect to the proletariat against the owners. And then that's bad news with the owners, because the workers will then take over the factories. They will confiscate the means of production and declare a dictatorship of the proletariat. And so you have the revolution. This dictatorship of the proletariat is not communism. It's not. But it's a necessary stage to communism. So we overthrow our overlords, our capitalistic overlords. The bourgeoisie is overthrown. And we have a dictatorship of the proletariat as the proletariat sees the means of production. But this is temporary. Okay, very important to understand this for Marx. Eventually, people will learn to govern themselves without leaders, without a state, because a state really is just a tool of class domination. Remember, again, economics is primary. The state is secondary. And so the state will be unnecessary, and the workers will understand that they don't need to be governed by a state. Private ownership of at least of the means of production will be abolished. That doesn't necessarily mean that all private property will be abolished, but just the means of production, right? Everybody will be equal, finally. And goods and services will be distributed according to need, because there'll be no profit motive. This is true communism. Never been achieved. It's an aspirational goal. But this is true communism. This is what Marx meant by communism. No state, no ownership, goods and services distributed according to need. True communism. And understand here that Marx had a truly cosmopolitan view, because in communism there are no classes. And because there are no classes, there is no politics, no nations, no states, no other distinctions that could set people apart from one another. Only then will people truly be free. What an amazing vision. What an amazing cosmopolitan vision. What went wrong? What went wrong? What went wrong? Okay, so to begin with, capitalism didn't collapse in the way that Marx anticipated. At least, capitalism didn't collapse, at least not yet. And point of fact, and this is a fact, again, an inconvenient fact, that the world has become exponentially richer, and standards of living have continually risen around the world for everyone around the world. And you look at the last, the post-World War II period of economic development, I mean, it's extraordinary. Globalization and capitalism have led to the greatest increase of standards of living around the world, for even the poorest people are much better off. And that's, again, you can say that Marx did anticipate that, and that was necessary, but of course, the next step would be socialism and then communism, right? But communism hasn't appeared in the way that Marx anticipated. The harsh conditions of early capitalism, and we have to be fair to Marx because the capitalism that he understood was the capitalism of the Industrial Revolution, which was brutal. But the harsh conditions of early capitalism have been ameliorated by unions, minimum wage laws, health care, health benefits, and a variety of social welfare programs. And so even the ownership class has rapidly expanded. It is not uncommon for workers to have an ownership stake in the company they work at. Many contemporary socialists or social democrats outright reject Marx principles and accept the private ownership of capital, opting instead for redistribution by taxation, right? Government regulation of industry, a robust social safety net. This kind of mixed economy is the norm in the Nordic and Scandinavian nations. Further, and this is very disturbing, countries that attempted to adopt Marxism have almost universally failed, with many, if not most, devolving into some form of authoritarianism. And the results, quite frankly, have been catastrophic. How do we get there from Marx? And that's its own story, really. And I think to understand this, you have to understand the inheritor of Marx, Lenin. Why authoritarianism? So why did the Marxist project, which had so much potential, why did it devolve into authoritarianism? And so Lenin advanced his own interpretation of Marxism, radically altering some of Marx's ideas. Some of that was just pragmatic. Some of it was a problem because Russia was not an industrialized, developed country like Germany was, where Marx was from. And so Lenin did face certain problems in applying the Marxist program to a nation that was, quite frankly, not ready for industrialization. Lenin believed that the old capitalist class would not quietly surrender its privileges. He's probably right about that. But would inevitably resist the revolution by force, sabotage, and conspiracy. And this is true. I mean, there was a lot of hostility to the Bolsheviks after they took over power in the early Soviet Union. There was a lot of hostility and resistance, and in fact, a civil war. So authoritarianism, including censorship and suppression of dissent, was necessary to defend the revolution. That was just the compromise that Lenin had to make. Additionally, however, Lenin argued that the workers could not develop revolutionary consciousness on their own. Because they could not actually understand, they could not be trusted to understand their true interests. They could be easily misled. They could be bribed by trinkets and baubles like, social reforms and trade unionism. Lenin had a very, very poor opinion of the trade unionists. So these workers would focus on short-term economic gains rather than challenging the system. Okay, maybe Lenin had a point here. So why can't the workers be trusted to know what is in their interest? And here we have the problem of false consciousness. Now, Engels uses this phrase, false consciousness. Marx doesn't use it a lot, but he talks about something akin to it. And later Marxists would definitely rely on this idea of false consciousness. What is false consciousness? Well, the ruling class of a society will set up social, religious, familial, legal, and political institutions that serve their own interests. And most Ordinary people will accept this as being right. This is normal. So we don't think about the cultural hegemony from within the society within which we live. Okay, so we're surrounded by these institutions, and ideas that we take as being normal, in fact, may simply be a pretext for a type of oppression. So most workers are incapable of seeing their actual situation. So, example, Western ideas of due process, rights-based liberalism, freedom of speech, representative democracy, all of these seem to benefit the working class. But Marxism argues that these ideas only serve the interest of the ruling class in our society. For example, why should you care about voting when you can only vote for someone that will exploit you? Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. It's the same system. The system doesn't change because you elect a different political party. It's the same exploitive, oppressive system. Just has a new face. Why should you care about the court system when the law is only used to oppress you? Doesn't make any sense. The structure always operates in favor of the people who own the system. You can't change the system from within. It's impossible. So Lenin argued that the people need a vanguard, a small set of professional revolutionaries working on behalf of the workers or the proletariat to seize the state and take control of the economy. Now, okay, I think that you guys could see the problem here. Because once these revolutionaries take power, once the vanguard of the proletariat take power, are they going to voluntarily give up that power? Well, that's what Lenin believed. Lenin believed this would only be temporary. But in practice, you can see exactly what happens. Nobody gives up power. Nobody does. No, once you take the power, nobody's giving that power up. Sorry, that's just the way it is. In practice, this led to the centralization of power and authoritarianism under the Communist Party in most communist states. And of course, that was Communist Party in name only because, again, communism has not been achieved. The dictatorship of the proletariat is only supposed to be temporary. But they build a party structure and a power structure and a centralized authoritarian government, and that's not going to go away. Just doesn't. Again, meet the new boss, pretty much the same as the old boss, right? Just a different color flag. When we get to Stalin, okay, now we have an entirely different program, and you have, real Marxist, a brilliant Marxist ideologue who wants to carry forward ideas of the revolution, Trotsky, who is completely outmaneuvered by this low-level party bureaucrat, Stalin, who doesn't really care about ideology, but is very concerned with creating his own power base. And of course, Trotsky ends up, with an ice axe in his chest in Mexico City, and Stalin solidifies his power, pretty much by eliminating everyone who would oppose him. So Stalin transforms the Soviet Union into a permanent system of centralized control. Socialism in one country, it's called. And Stalin believed he could build a socialist state independently even while being surrounded by hostile powers. And of course, the existence of those hostile powers justifies almost any political measure as self-defense, right? This justified permanent authoritarianism as being necessary to defend socialism from its from its internal and external enemies. Mao is doing exactly the same thing in China. So anybody who disagrees with you is an enemy of the state, and they get sent to the gulag or shot. And all the people who came up with Lenin, with very few exceptions, they're rivals to Stalin and they're murdered. Now, an alternative to Marx, democratic socialism. And anybody who's a democratic socialist today, this is pretty much what we're talking about. And this is an alternative to Marxism. Edward Bernstein. Bernstein argued that capitalism wasn't collapsing, as Marx had predicted. The working class actually was not becoming poorer, and socialism was not historically inevitable. Well, you got to bite the bullet. So instead of revolution, what do? Bernstein argued that socialism could be gradually achieved through democratic reforms, ethical principles, improving workers' conditions within existing institutions. And this is the democratic socialist movement. And yeah, it goes all the way back to Bernstein as an alternative to Marx. We reconcile ourselves to capitalism, and we focus on improving the system, improving the lives of workers. Eventually, we get to something that resembles socialism through reform. Now, in response to this, the Marxists argue that capitalism can't be reformed. Distributive approaches, and you go back and think about Rawls and redistribution and benefits for the workers, that's not going to work because it misses the deeper issue, the deeper contradiction within capitalism. The capitalist mode of production itself is exploitative because workers don't control the means of production. And as long as workers don't control the means of production, they will always be exploited. As long as workers have to sell their labor, redistributing wealth merely adjusts the symptoms of injustice while leaving the core relationship of domination untouched. And so that's the Marxist response to social democrats. Now, there's a challenge to Marx from Marx's left, and this is the anarchist challenge. And so we have Mikhail Bakunin, and Bakunin is a fascinating figure. He's problematic. I mean, he's pretty much an anti-Semite, okay? But Bakunin is a very compelling and interesting person, and he has a great critique of Marx that gets right to the core of it. Marx talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat. And Bakunin says, yeah, the key phrase there is dictatorship. Because if there's a state, any state at all, there's domination. You can't have a state without oppression. Doesn't matter what color flag you're flying. If you have a state, you have domination and oppression. You have domination and oppression, essentially, you have slavery. A state without slavery is inconceivable. So that's why we're enemies of the state. You want a revolution? You don't have a dictatorship of the proletariat. You just don't have a government. You just have a people's collective or whatever, but you can't have a state. So both Marx and Bakunin sought abolition of capitalism. That's true. But Marx argued that the working class must seize state power. And Bakunin thought that's a recipe for disaster. Bakunin warned that Marx's model would simply replace one ruling class with another. If you're a worker, what difference does it make? If you're exploited under capitalism or communism, you're still exploited. The communist state or the capitalist state doesn't matter, right? You're just replacing one ruling class with another. So Bakunin believed that any state, even a proletarian state, would become tyrannical and therefore had to be abolished. And so he argued for a spontaneous popular insurrection leading to immediate collectivist anarchism. So anarchism was the only solution. All right. The legacy of Marxism, critical theory, and the Frankfurt School. And this really I should have this as a topic of a separate lecture because it's a complicated and interesting, topic. So critical theory emerged out of the Marxist tradition, what we refer to as critical theory. I'm not talking specifically about critical race theory, which has gotten a lot of attention, but if you understand the Frankfurt School and critical theory in general, it's not a big leap to get to that, if you're interested in that. But critical theory emerged out of the Marxist tradition and was developed by a group of sociologists at the University of Frankfurt in pre-war Germany. Critical theory aimed to uncover the mechanisms that kept human beings from seeing how the world actually works. So we think of the problem of false consciousness. What is it that stops people from understanding the ways in which they are exploited? Why do people buy into the system so much? And why are the mechanisms of oppression invisible? So critical theory's main focus was on the way power and inequality were embedded in cultural institutions and narratives, the stories that we tell. And again, you can think about the narrative about classical liberalism and the individual and freedom and democracy and constitutionalism and all of those stories that we tell. Well, the critical theorist wanted to unpack the power and inequality at the heart of all of those stories. And if you look, you'll see it. You might not see it until you look, but if you look, you'll see it. The way that power works its way through those institutions in exploitive and oppressive ways. Critical theory argues that power is always unevenly distributed in society and is always used to maintain and reproduce social inequality. So whatever form of government you end up with, it's going to privilege some people and exploit others. And the institutions that are created tend to reify that dynamic and reinforce that dynamic. And so the people at the top remain at the top, and the people at the bottom remain at the bottom. Oh, interesting point. Why do things never seem to really change? Why do the people at the bottom tend to stay at the bottom? Interesting question, right? Well, the critical theorists say, hey, there's a reason for that because the deck is stacked against them. It's not a fair game. And there's a reason why you can't win this game is because you're not supposed to win. Now, later critical theorists also sought to transform this power dynamic in a positive way, right? So we're talking about people like Adorno and Walter Benjamin and Horkheimer. These are the people who came directly out of the Frankfurt School. Now, as Hitler rose to power, they fled Europe. Benjamin, of course, did not make it. But Adorno and Horkheimer ended up in California, of all places, and were no happier than they were in Europe. In fact, they were miserable here. And that's its own kind of story. But they were very critical of capitalism. And Adorno argued that post-industrial capitalism had created a perfect system of control. What does he mean by a perfect system of control? After all, he saw, authoritarianism in Europe and fascism but how does capitalism perfect control in a way that the fascist dictatorships could never do? Well, because the people are complicit here. So you get a mass consumer society within which individuals are oppressed by restrictive economic forces. So people willingly participate in their own oppression. And so the oppression becomes invisible to them. Interesting theory. So mass culture plays a role in this. And you think about, TV and now, of course, Adorno never dreamed of the internet, but the internet and the mass culture that we consume. So television, popular music, other forms of media delude the working classes. They act as a way to subjugate the working class. They delude the working classes into accepting a subordinate and degrading role in society. There's no alternative. And they buy into this. So capitalism uses culture to distract workers from confronting their exploitation. Now, it's not that the workers don't feel depression or sadness. They just don't make that connection, that it's the economic system. So there are counter narratives that are created to explain why you feel alienated, why you feel sad, why you feel depressed, why you feel anxiety. There's probably something wrong with you. And so mass culture says there's a solution to your sadness. Consume more. It's never, you need to confront the contradictions in the economic system in which you are simply a cog in a machine. And of course you feel alienated and depressed. Who wouldn't? That's a natural human reaction to being in the situation that you're in. No, it's never that. There's a problem with you. Here, let's try to fix that through more consumption. So this brings us to Marcuse, and Marcuse was one of the later critical theorists and very active. He's writing in the 60s and 70s. And Marcuse is very influenced by Freud and Freud's writings on repression and sublimation. And so Marcuse argues that capitalism and the state collude together to create, wait for it, artificial needs and forced consumption. Oh, imagine that. Imagine an economic and political system that are cultivating artificial needs. So we consume stuff that we don't even need. So material comforts and superficial freedoms create what Marcuse refers to as a one-dimensional man who's incapable of resisting domination. And so when the workers feel alienated, as of course they will, and when they're depressed or when they feel anxiety, they're blamed for their own alienation. You're the problem. So, Christina, you don't like going to that warehouse. You don't like Monday mornings and driving to your job, and you feel like it doesn't matter, and you feel like you're being exploited, and no one, that's your fault. That's on you. But we can fix that. We can address that. So, look, it's not like the old style of oppression and exploitation, because capitalism does provide workers with higher standard of living and a higher income. But what's the purpose of that? Is to make them better consumers. Yeah, money is the answer to everything. So the economic system designs mass culture to encourage people to strive for more income, so they can buy more things. And you would think, wait a minute, there's only so many things that I can buy, right? Human beings have only so many needs to be addressed. And like when I have safety, and I have home, and I have the ability to have enough free time to enjoy myself, there's really nothing else that I need. But wait, there's more. Because the economic system actually cultivates new needs, new consumer needs. You need newer things, bigger things, better things. And technology reinforces this system by controlling the external world and the inner lives of individuals. You're not enough. What you have is not enough. You need more. You need to consume more. Here's something shiny and new that will make you feel better. And if it doesn't make you feel better, that's your fault. We give the poor welfare payments and therapy. That's the answer. Welfare payments and therapy. And antidepressant medication to alleviate symptoms of their alienation. Oh, you're depressed? Here's a pill. Don't think about your exploitation. Don't think about the contradictions within the economic system. Don't pay attention to that. Just take this pill. And when you feel better, you can get back to doing what you should have been doing in the first place, buying more stuff that you don't really need. Freud, and remember that Marcuse is kind of a Freudian, had demonstrated how civilization represses human desire in order to maintain stability. That's a big part of Freud's thinking. That repression is actually necessary to maintain the social order, because humans have these libidinal desires, and these libidinal desires are disruptive. And people just can't act on every instinct without destroying the social order. So repression is necessary. For Freud, repression is necessary. But Marcuse argues that modern capitalism goes even further. There's like surplus repression. So the modern economic system not only represses human desire in order to maintain control, but it channels that desire into labor, consumption, and conformity. So it's just like sublimation going on. Our natural desires are 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 channeled into unnatural appetites for things that we don't need. But Marcuse argues that we could escape this if we wanted to. We could create a better system. We could create a society based on eros, on desire, pleasure, play, art, freedom, rather than consumption. And so instead of economic necessity and constant labor, we could liberate ourselves from this repression. In such a society, labor would resemble art. We would reconnect, go back to what Marx was talking about originally. We would reconnect with our own labor. And again, our labor could directly make the world a better place for us, for those around us. It could be an outlet for our creativity and the free expression of ideas, the genuinely free expression of ideas. And we could express our desires in non-destructive ways. But this would be another kind of revolution. And is very, very far away from the society in which we get in our cars, we commute, we show up at the factory, and we put boxes on a truck. All right. All right. Uh, I had a good time. I hope that you guys did. I hope that you enjoyed this. I really like this material a lot. I think it's interesting, and it was yeah, there was a lot of stuff there, but I mean, you guys can go back over it, and again, you have the whole rest of your lives to figure this out.